guests, art lovers, and art supporters. Thank you so much for being here today for Sarp's, French-Turkish artist Sarp's new project called LUNAR at the Elgiz Museum. Before I start, I would like to thank Elgiz family and the museum itself. They've been great supporters of emerging artists up until today, and they're the first contemporary art museum founded in 2001 in Turkey. So it's a pleasure working with them for this project. Before we start our conversation and talk about LUNAR, maybe you can expand on your previous works, specifically on Substitutes for Your Father and also in the Closet project. And after that, following the Mashallah series that kind of led to this. Sarp.
Hi everyone, welcome first of all, thank you for joining us. The images that you see behind us are some of the photographs that I first began to take when I first started taking photographs. And my initial concern, my initial drive behind making art was, how do I make art that asks questions about masculinity, about gender, about how we envision gender, and about how gender is performed in day-to-day life. And having grown up here, where there's a very eclectic mix of traditional Middle Eastern ideas and values surrounding masculinity, but also growing up being exposed to a lot of Western media, where ideas of masculinity were somewhat similar and somewhat completely different, I wanted to create a body of work that asked questions about both societies' approach to maleness, to boyhood, and to these fantasies of men that we construct and that we are exposed to in contemporary art practices and also throughout our history. And so when I was in Oberlin College in the middle of nowhere in Ohio, surrounded by cornfields, at first I thought, okay, I don't have any idea, like how do I take pictures of these here? Where do I go? Who do I talk to? And I started befriending a lot of people who happened to be professional sports players. Varsity football, varsity soccer, swimming, running, all these ideas of masculinity that I felt I could never achieve growing up in Turkey, because even though I went to a school that had a lot of sports facilities just around the corner, I was not the sporty kid. I liked doing Model United Nations, and I liked being class president more. So, to my surprise, this group of men who represented a kind of masculinity that I thought was inaccessible to me embraced me with open arms. And more importantly, they invited me to these fascinating old locker rooms of Oberlin College that were built over 100 years ago, and that still retain their original structure, their original architecture. So a lot of the times, I would take pictures of these naturally vintage spaces, and I would try to reference art history in some capacity or another, or I would try to reference things that I have seen, things that exist in my head as what men should look like, or what men do when they play sports and then they go to the locker room afterwards and they've won the game and they're triumphant. And moving away from that, I thought, well, what if I did that in this geography, in this region? So at first, I took this portrait in a hammam, in a Turkish bath in Antalya, south of Turkey.
And there's the tiles.
Yeah, and this was the beginning of my exposure to a more Orientalist tradition. And I didn't know at the time that this photograph, specifically this one, was going to become sort of my guiding light into the rest of my artistic practice.
And also, I guess, because, yes, you do live in the United States, but you come quite often, and one cannot escape from their cultural kind of heritage.
Exactly.
And history. So, should I continue with the second question?
Well, I'm just going to, I'm briefly going to talk about substitutes for my father. So one of the reasons why I had such an obsession, I guess we can say, about masculinity was because growing up, my father was not really in the picture. It was mostly me and my mother. And so one of the reasons why I was worried about my own masculinity and my ability to access these male spaces was because I didn't have a male role model in my life. And I thought, okay, well, why don't I directly talk about this? So I started asking other men in my life, my friends, to tell me stories about their fathers in a series that later became known as Substitutes for My Father. And I worked on this series for 3 years, and it was always Polaroid because I wanted it to be intimate. So I would interview a man for maybe an hour, maybe 20 minutes, and sometimes for half a day. And they would tell me these crazy stories about their fathers. Oh, he's my best friend. Oh, he used to go fishing. Oh, when I was 12, he took me to a whorehouse, patted me on the back and said, "Time to be a man, son." You know, the entire spectrum of father-son relationships. and so out of this research project really came about 100 Polaroids and about 500 stories. And I ended up combining them at my very first exhibition in Turkey, which was at the Istanbul Modern Museum 4 years ago.
4 years ago. So for the first, I mean, the second time now you're being shown at a museum,
yes.
a collection in Turkey, a solo show. But this is what, like 30th
this
project?
This is my 30th exhibition. Yeah. Between then and now, so I don't know how that happened. I really don't. But the nice thing about Substitutes for My Father was that it exposed me to a lot of ideas about masculinity that at some point I think were ultimately cathartic in a way that made me feel at peace. And in a lot of ways it finished the research for me. So I thought, okay, it's time to talk about something else, which is how I ended up reaching the Mashallah series. Do you want to talk a little bit about it first?
Yeah, maybe we can start the conversation and then I'll go to you. In the Mashallah series, you touch upon the historical and cultural taboos in a very interesting way, in projecting Islamic motifs that we're exposed to in our daily lives, whether it's from the Islamic tiles or the Quran. Onto male body parts, but you also really kind of distort and change these body parts as well. In LUNAR, you chose to work with the images of the moon produced by NASA in the 1960s, covering the whole flooring of the mezzanine, which if you haven't seen it, please go upstairs after. You've also projected these using the female body as a canvas in a site of science fiction. Can you please expand on how this evolved and what it means to you, also in the current context?
My journey into using Islamic imagery actually started with 1 year of not being able to make any art. After 2013, after the Gezi protests, I was supposed to start grad school at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I left Turkey and my mother and in a political turmoil that made me feel very guilty about leaving. And I didn't know how to talk about it because I was taking pictures of the protests, and then I realized everyone around me is taking pictures of the protests. So why are mine art and theirs not? So I thought, okay, if this is something I want to talk about, how do I begin to talk about it? How do I address what is happening in this climate, in this entire region, not necessarily even in Turkey, without overdoing it or without turning into protest porn? How do I do it without showing people on the streets or policemen and so forth? And I was wandering around the Art Institute and I saw at the museum gift shop a book about traditional Iznik tiles, traditional Islamic imagery from the Ottoman Empire. And there was a spotlight on the book and it said $9.99 today only. And I thought, okay, that's a sign. That's literally a sign that maybe I should buy this book. So I got the book, and I had the patterns, but I had no idea what to do with them. So I said, what if I did something similar to in the closet, but instead of the locker rooms, I used the background with these motifs. So I installed the projector into the studio, and I wandered around in the hallway of the Art Institute, and I saw this poor freshman, and I go, you, come here for a minute. And he came in, and I said, do you have 5 minutes? I just need to try something. And I was going to have him stand in front of the wall, but he walked in front of the projector. And it just landed on his body, and I thought, wait, this looks more interesting.
Yeah.
This is more exciting than anything else. So I said, wait, come back. And he stood in front of it, and it just lit the side of his body. And the way the projector wrapped around him, it looked like it was a sculpture almost. So I thought, there's potential here for something. There's a way that I can use this wrapping, this beautiful pattern on these bodies to talk about something larger, using a symbolic language and using a language that I found very beautiful. And I ended up creating what later became known as the Mashallah series.
Beautiful.
And my intention with that was to sort of address how the traditions, not just the religion, but the traditional outlook, our mentality here does not really permit people to be human, does not really allow for the visibility of humanness. And this is most noticeable in the fact that throughout Islamic tradition, with the exception of the Ottoman miniatures, there are no portraits. And if there are, they're made by other artists. Like during the Renaissance, a lot of artists come from Italy to paint portraits of the sultans, but Turkish artists themselves are not permitted to create these likenesses of these Ottoman sultans in the way that we would recognize them today. Instead, there's a lot of these patterns, and there's a lot of politics that goes into these patterns, I later discovered. For example, in this tile, the cloud motif actually touches upon ideas of Sufism. And they started inserting the idea of the cloud into traditional carpets and into the Iznik tiles once the idea of Sufism became widely accepted and widespread throughout this geography, throughout this region. And the clouds actually represent the temporality of life, how life is fleeting like a cloud. And they put this inside the carpets that we still use today, and nobody talks about this. And it drives me crazy because there's so much meaning, there's so much poetry in just the tiles that we see in the Turkish hammams that we can still access today. But there's, at some point, a level of meaning is lost almost.
I think it's because we go to the Grand Bazaar, we see it, we go to the duty-free shop while we're traveling, especially in Turkey. I see the motifs. It becomes a part of our daily lives, and obviously there's such a historical and meaningful story behind these, but perhaps maybe because we're exposed to them and in different contexts. Also, these are printed on different bags, or and then it becomes something that is used and then thrown, and it's we do live in a
because we are not taught the art history. There's nothing about that.
And because we also live in a consumerist society, was what I was going to say, but the lack of art history is also a big thing, yes.
I think maybe specifically in Turkey, somewhere in our journey into becoming secular, we lost the distinction between what we consider religious and conservative and what we consider religious and valuable. And I think that distinction is something that I'm trying to address here as well. And over the past 4 years that I've worked on the Mashallah series, the series has been exhibited everywhere. We just finished a show in Sydney, in Australia last week. And before that it was in Jakarta, and before Jakarta we did Dubai, Istanbul, Copenhagen, and Shanghai. So in a way I'm really trying to also talk about the art that comes from this region by promoting it outside of Turkey as well. And after 4 years, I really felt at the end of last year that it was time for me to start talking about something new. But I wasn't entirely sure how to approach it, which is how the LUNAR project started.
Yes, and funnily enough, I knew Sarp from way before when I was studying here in Turkey at Enka College. And we always kept on our paths crossed.
Yeah.
And, at the end, we decided to collaborate on a project. Sarp told me he wants to work on something new, and I said, great, yes, I mean, after 4 years, we love Mashallah series, but come on, let's do something else. So we then, slowly you show me the photos that you've taken of LUNAR, which is a kind of a step from Mashallah series, and you still use the projection, but it's in a completely different context. So maybe you can expand a bit on that, and then I'll ask more questions.
Yes. Actually, though, before I even forget, I have to also address one more thing, which is the Revenge series, without which none of this would have happened. Because Revenge was my first attempt at using projections and the female form. And it was really a parenthesis, because in my practice in Chicago, I was assisting a Japanese photographer named Mayumi Lake, and she exposed me to a lot of amazing anime, but historical anime from the 1980s, that really shaped my practice. And one movie that stuck with me the most was Akira, which tells the story of a science fiction dystopic Neo-Tokyo set in the late 2020s. And the story of Akira is very similar to basically the Arab Spring, where there's a lot of riots, there's a lot of people my age, and there's a lot of violence. And I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about it in a way that maybe Mashallah was missing. It was like the other half of Mashallah, so to speak. So what I started doing was, I started taking images, scenes from Akira, and using them, I combined them with a female performer by the name of Miss Tosh, whose entire practice is actually burlesque.
I was going to say, how she moves.
Yeah. So the idea was to use a female figure, but to use it in a way that where the female that I'm using is also empowered. It's not a traditional photographer naked woman relationship where I'm the one in power and she's vulnerable. She is actually co-directing this entire thing. It's her choreography. And she just saw the video, saw the film, and she said, I understand. Just let me do my thing. And I said, okay, I trust you. And we basically ran the entire film, and she performed her dance routine in front of it, combining ideas of erotic pleasure and female nudity and exposure and vulnerability with the violence that I was trying to address. And these were all light boxes that we showed in Istanbul 2 years ago. And it was a fun journey for me, but I knew that I didn't want to make something that depended entirely on the creation of another artist, in this case, another movie. I knew that I wanted to make something that I could own, so this was a small series that I discontinued after a while. And we got to LUNAR.
Should I talk a bit about
yes,
the
I was
symbol
going to.
of the moon? Or?
No, you can start.
Okay. The moon symbolizes many different things. It determines the passage of time in Islam, but the charts that survey it and the attempts of conquering it, however, are the products of the Western thinking. So when you're explaining a bit about LUNAR, why did you choose the moon? Why the woman? You kind of explained it upstairs for the people who got to see the project, but maybe you can expand a bit on this.
Well, one of the ideas we had was that traditionally the moon, at least in mythology, is always regarded as female. And for some reason the sun is male, and I never understood why. But one of the primary reasons why is because the moon actually represents the female reproductive cycle. And so throughout history it was associated with femaleness. One of the reasons why I was thinking about the moon was because NASA declassified their archives of lunar imagery that they started creating in the 1960s during the Cold War. They made hundreds of maps of the moon when they were planning the Apollo missions, trying to decide where the shuttles can land on the moon. But they were also releasing a lot of the images that they took once they landed. So there's some really beautiful high-resolution imagery of lunar maps and pictures that Buzz Aldrin took when they landed. And I was looking at all of these archives. There are gigabytes and gigabytes of images on the NASA website, and I thought, there's so rich history here, and there's also so much political context here, because we're looking at something that was done entirely for political purposes. the United States went to the moon to beat the Soviet Union. There was an urge to defend the nation, so to speak, when this happened. And naturally, all the people involved in the project, most of the people involved in the project, were male. The astronauts that were chosen were male. And it's just now that we're getting to a place where we're sending women to space. In fact, I just found this out over the course of the research of LUNAR, that a woman holds the record for most space-time, because she just returned to the planet like last week. She spent 527 days on the International Space Station. So I thought, this is amazing, we're finally putting women on the moon. But how do we do that from this region if we're not sending our girls to school? Because as all of this is happening, there's so many laws that are being passed right now in this region, especially in Turkey, where women aren't necessarily prevented from going to school, they're just permitted to not to be sent to receive an education. And as a result, it's becoming harder and harder for young girls to actually get to the point where they can be sent to the International Space Station or even the moon. And I was watching a TV show last year where there's an imam and there's a coliseum full of people. It's an outdoor program during Ramadan where people come and they ask questions to the imam and the imam answers them. And there was a 13-year-old boy and he says, I have a question. If I go to the moon and they found ice on the moon, if they melt that ice, and if I wash myself with that water before I pray, is it acceptable or will I go to hell? And I thought, this poor kid, he has such an imagination. He's already there. He's already on the moon. And this is what he's worried about. He's actually worried about washing himself and this being not acceptable according to Islam. And the imam goes, oh, it's about your intention, whatever. And I thought, okay, but how do we actually get there? Why are we not making a bigger effort to send our children to receive the education that they need? Why aren't there any space rockets? Why isn't there an Ottoman base on the moon? None of these are necessarily crazy questions to ask. It's just that throughout history, over the past 200 years, people from this region have made very specific choices. And as a result, a completely different nation that didn't even exist until 300 years ago managed to land on the moon and pretty much controls the entire space around the planet. And I find this fascinating, and I keep asking myself, what would it look like if we sent people to the moon and they were women? Wouldn't that be amazing? And so, because of that, I actually covered the entire floor with maps of the moon that are printed on very light 4X. So if you set foot on them with your high heels, you will leave a mark on the lunar surface.
Yeah, and it's a great, part of the whole 2 months process as well, because the more we land on the moon, literally, there will be some resonance, and I'm excited to see the changes.
I'm excited to see the changes as well.
Maybe you can talk a bit about the materiality of this as well.
Yes. Another decision that we had to make when we decided to make it cover the entire mezzanine was, what material do we print this on? Because we have the images and they're big enough that we can print them on anything. And I thought, well, what if we printed on tools, on curtains? What if we printed on a material that is traditionally associated with domesticity and with femininity? What would that look like? What would that mean when we go up there and we see women triumphant, conquering space, but they're printed on a material that is basically associated with almost the suppression of women in society, where they're saying, no, you stay at home, you deal with the things that need to be done at home. So when they were delivering the curtains to me, the guy goes, these are machine washable up to 30 degrees, you can wash them if you want. I said, great, that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And when we were installing, it was unlike any other exhibition experience I've ever had, because we weren't installing frames, we were hanging curtains. And I was imagining every time I show these works, there will be a man hanging curtains. And that's really satisfying to me, because I'm really interested in forcing people to cross those lines and making men do things that they think women should be doing.
Yeah, and thank you, Suleiman Bey, for helping us actually talking about men. You talked a bit about like how this kind of, you know, your fascination between Bond movies.
Yes.
And how these kind of, yeah, woman images are kind of inspired by that. So maybe you talk a bit about those.
The layout upstairs, you'll see, it's not one complete curtain. There's 4 different women printed on 4 different textiles. The reason why they're laid out like that is because I grew up watching a lot of Bond movies and they were my favorite movies growing up. I was so in love with them.
I guess all of us here today have.
But my favorite parts were the intro sequences. You know, after he shoots and then you cut to a place where you see the director's name and then beautiful women fall from the sky. And then in the movie, James Bond meets these beautiful women, he has sex with them, and then they die. Every single time. That's the formula. And I thought, what if I took that imagery of the intro sequence, where these beautiful women are falling from the sky, but what if they don't need James Bond? What if there is no James Bond? What if they got to the sky all by themselves, and it was their story? They weren't side characters, they weren't going to get killed off, there's no tragedy. They made it up there, they succeeded, they're powerful, and they're looking over you, they're bigger than you, they're larger than life. So in a way, it's my little homage to James Bond, as well as my critique of James Bond and of Western imagery that keeps forcing ideas of beautiful women into narratives where these women have to be secondary characters. And when you go up there, you'll be able to better see it, but the reason why they're also printed on tulle is because when they're lit from the back, they actually look like they're floating in space, they look free.
Yeah, we've added like a bit of fan so that you can see a bit of movement within the space, which is quite, you know, it shows the delicacy of the material as well.
Should we ask the audience if they have any questions, or do you have any questions?
Well, before I open up to the audience, I want to ask, you know, there's mashallah, there's this, you so eloquently explained the whole process of your work. What is next?
You know, it's funny, when she told me she was going to ask this question earlier, I was like, sure, I'll answer, but now I'm thinking I want to keep it a secret. So I'll just tell you the name, because the name is definite. And it's called Birds of Paradise.
Wow.
But I haven't actually done it yet, so I don't want to jinx it.
My name is actually Huma Kabakcı.
I know.
I like it.
So that's my next project, and hopefully I will be able to display it next year in the spring.
Any questions?
Yes.
Are those